I'm starting with the toe kick for the base, and I'm making that from 1/2 inch maple plywood. And even though this is perfectly smooth, there is almost always some dirt on there that needs to be cleaned off. So I'm going to go over it with a random orbit sander with a 220 grit disc. I cut these off the end of the sheet so that the grain would be running vertical. However, that means that the longer ones that I have are not quite long enough, so I need to add to them. And I'm just going to do that with biscuits and glue. Now, putting it together, I need to set back the ends by 1 inch. So I cut a spacer and clamp that in place so I can put the toe kick up against it and drive in some 1.5 brads. While the glue is drying, I can cut some more parts. These pieces go inside the base and angle it out so that it'll be easier to sweep it out. It won't have a 90-degree corner. The legs of the cabinet go right down to the floor, so these outriggers that I'm putting on here close up the gap behind them. Now that the base is fully assembled, I'm going to take it out back and spray on 3 coats of water-based polyurethane. It's a lot faster and easier to do it now with the sprayer than try to do it later with a brush down on the floor. While I'm waiting for the finish to dry, I can do more cutting. This is a piece of 5/8 inch melamine that I'm going to use for the bottom of the cabinet, and I'm also going to cut more 1/2 inch maple plywood for the front panels and the 2 sides. And once again, I'm going to pre-finish those panels with 3 coats of water-based polyurethane. In fact, I'm going to be pre-finishing all of the parts for this project before I install them. I made some very careful measurements to locate the base on the floor where it needs to be. And to hold it in place, I'm just going to use blocks in the corners that are glued down to the tile floor. I'm not going to try to drill holes through this ceramic tile, and despite what you might think, this will hold just fine. No way is that ever going to hold. As soon as you walk into it, you're going to knock it right out of place. With the base installed, it's a good idea to seal around it. And with that done, I can get the melamine bottom of the cabinet installed next. Now that I have that done, I can get the front and side panels installed. These are the ones that I cut out and pre-finished with 3 coats of water-based polyurethane. And these are fastened in place with glue and 1.5 inch brads. What I'm cutting here are more parts for the base. These are what I'm calling legs, even though they're just corner pieces that go on the base. And I'm making these from plywood because it actually works out to be a little bit cheaper, and also is a better match for the panels that I made from the same plywood. The tricky part is getting the plywood to bend around the corner, and to do that I'm going to cut a V-groove in the bottom. But first I need to put some tape on the top to help hold it together while I make the cuts and make the bend. legs on the front are wide on both sides, but the legs on the back are narrow where the drawers will be. While I'm waiting for the glue to dry on those, I can cut the parts that will be the stiles and rails of the panels. And again, I'm using the same 1/2-inch plywood, and I'm cutting the strips to just under 3 inches wide. And with that done, I can bring them out back and spray on 3 coats of water-based polyurethane again. And by this time the legs are dry, so I can get those sprayed as well. And while I'm waiting for that finish to dry, I can make another part. These are bases for the legs made from solid wood. This is mainly for looks, also for durability. The corners of a cabinet always take the most abuse, and it's always a good idea to use solid wood there whenever possible. Once again, these are put together the same way with a glued miter joint to make them 90 degrees so they'll wrap around the corner. And there are actually 2 in here, so what I need to do after the glue dries is cut them in half. And then it's very difficult to get the exact right width when you're doing a miter like that. So what I did was I made them wider than they need to be, and now I can trim off the excess. I'm also going to chamfer the top, and I'm doing that on my table saw. And the reason why I'm stopping part of the way through the cut here is to keep that small piece from getting sucked into the blade and ruining my cut. I'm also going to add a chamfer to the side, but this is going to be tapered from nothing on the bottom to all the way on the top. Back in the kitchen, I can get those legs installed. Everything is pre-finished, so I'm just going to hit this with some sandpaper to make sure that the glue has something better to stick to. And it's mainly the glue that holds it in place, but I'm going to fire in some short enough pins that will act as clamps. With the corners installed, I can put on the rails. And I'm not going to use the tape to measure this. I'm going to hold it in place, mark it, bring it out to my shop, cut it, bring it back in, check it to make sure it's the right length, and then glue it in place. And it's basically the same procedure for the rest of the strips. Next, I need to make some solid wood trim, and this will go around the inside of the panels, covering the edge of the plywood, and also this matches the upper cabinet doors that I made before. I need to plane this down so it's just slightly thicker than the plywood that I used, and then bring it back to the table saw again and cut it to the right width. Next, I want to cut in a decorative detail. This is a small reveal, that's 1/8 of an inch wide. So I'm sorting out my pieces, putting the best looking face down. And that's the side that I'll cut. And to make that cut, I'm changing my blade to one that has flat teeth, so I'll get a nice, clean, flat bottom recess. And then of course, I'm not getting out of here without at least a little bit of sanding, just to knock the sharp edges off and make sure everything is nice and smooth. Then I can bring them out back and pre-finish them with 3 coats of water-based polyurethane. The top of the island overhangs the base on the front, so I need to make brackets that'll help support it. And I'll be making those, once again, from solid maple. I got this nice big thick chunk here to make the parts from. Now I need to cut a taper in these, and the fastest way to do this is to just glue a block on the back so that it's angled out away from the fence by the right amount. These brackets are mainly functional, but they're also decorative, and I'm adding a few more pieces to it. There's going to be 4 pieces in total, and this matches the trim that I did in the doorway that goes to my basement. And in here, stacking it up, you can see how this is going to work. I want to get these sanded and glued together before I bring them out and spray on the poly. To assemble these, I've clamped a board across my workbench and squared off that and put down a piece of tape, and that'll be a guideline for the top edge of these wedges so I can line them up, and I'll be able to cut it off square after the glue sets up. Getting this thing clamped up is even trickier than making it in the first place. Now that I have the trim finished, I can get it installed, but the first thing I want to do is trim off the ends on all of them at 45 degrees, and that'll give me my first cut. I'm not going to be measuring these to cut them to length. Instead, I'm going to be holding them up in place, marking them, and then cutting them, and then recutting it if I have to, and that will give me the best fit. Now that I have all the trim installed, I can get those brackets mounted. What I'm going to do is glue them and clamp them in place first, let the glue dry, and then drive in some long screws to reinforce it. Now that I have the base cabinet fully assembled, I can move on to the top. And I'm going to be making that from solid cherry. I got some pieces here that are 2 inches thick. I'm going to cut them to length. And then I need to flatten these. And probably one of my biggest regrets with the jointer that I built was not making the in-feed table and out-feed table long enough to accommodate thick, heavy stock like this. So I'm going to have to do it old school by planing one side roughly flat with an electric hand plane. And then I'll be able to run it through the thickness planer. And there are going to be 5 pieces that make up the top, so I'm going to do exactly the same thing over again 5 times. And then once again, I need to straighten one edge, and to do that, I've actually screwed on a straight edge onto the bottom where the holes won't be seen. And I'm going to run that up against the fence and then rip off the other edge with that fresh cut edge up against the fence. And what you're watching here is something that can happen. The saw starts to bind partway into the cut, and whenever this happens to me, I take it out again and recut the kerf. But another solution is to have a wedge handy and shove that in the kerf to keep it from closing on the blade. Eventually I got through it, and then I recut that edge because it was all burned up. With all the edges cut, I laid out the boards to see what it's going to look like and to get them in the right order. And to join these together, you only need glue. But I'm going to cut some domino slots, and that'll help to keep the pieces in line. You want to do whatever you can to make these line up perfectly on the surface, and that way you're not going to have to do a mountain of sanding. And I'm not going to put these together in my shop. I'm actually going to do them right in the kitchen on the cabinet that I just made. And I'm going to glue together 2 pieces at a time, clamp them up, let that dry overnight, then clamp on the next one, and so on and so forth until it's fully assembled. What I'm picking at here is some worm damage that's in one area, and I really couldn't avoid this without wasting too much of the wood. And one solution to fix this is to fill it with black epoxy to make it look like it's a knot or something. But instead I'm going to do an interesting Dutchman, and I'm going to use my CNC to cut out a template and then use that template to route out a pocket in the top for the Dutchman to fit in. And the interesting thing about this Dutchman is that it's a T-bone steak. The 2 woods that I'm going to use are ash for the bone and fat, and black walnut for the red meat. It was very close to a perfect fit, but a little fine tuning by hand made it slip right in. And then I could glue it in and then sand it off after the glue dried. And then by that time, of course, the glue was dry on everything and I could sand the top entirely. And then what I did was I flipped it over to sand the bottom and also get that finish before flipping it back over again. Oh, and while it was upside down, I also trimmed off the ends and then used the electric plane again to get rid of those saw cuts. The finish that I decided to use is boiled linseed oil, and I'm going to get a coat on the bottom, wipe off the excess and let it dry overnight, and then put another coat on the bottom after giving it a light scuffing and wipe off the excess and let that dry before flipping it back over so that the top side is up. And with the top facing up again, I can get the sanding finished and start putting the oil on. Once again, there'll be a coat and let that dry and then scuff, and then another coat and wipe off the excess and so on and so forth until I'm happy with the finish. And for such a simple finish, you'll probably agree with me when I say that this cherry looks absolutely gorgeous.